Jason had never been one to speak up in class. He sat at the back of the room, his head often buried in a book, trying to blend in with the rest of the students. He wasn't the smartest in the class, but he wasn't the slowest either. What he had was an undeniable strength, a quiet resilience that no one could see, and the kind of knowledge that some people, even adults, couldn't quite understand. Today, however, was different. Today, he had something to say. "Mr. Thompson said we should share something personal today," Jason had whispered to his friend, Marcus, just before the bell rang. "I think I'll tell them about my dad." Marcus gave him an encouraging smile, but Jason could tell he didn't quite believe it. "Are you sure about that? You know how people are. They'll laugh." Jason nodded, biting his lip nervously. But it didn't matter. It was time. Today was the day. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as Mrs. Henderson called on him to speak. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room on him, the weight of their gazes pressing down like 1,000 stones. His hands trembled as he stood up, his stomach in knots, but his mind was set. He was going to say it, no matter what. Clearing his throat, he said, "My dad works at the Pentagon." There it was. The words hung in the air, as if they were too heavy to be true, too strange to be believable. The moment he spoke those words, the room fell into an eerie silence. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, paused and looked up at him, her face a picture of disbelief. She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't the only one. The kids around him snickered and rolled their eyes, whispering under their breath. "You do?" Mrs. Henderson asked with a mockingly sweet tone, raising an eyebrow. She didn't even try to hide the skepticism in her voice. "And how exactly do you know that, Jason?" she asked, drawing out his name like a slow, painful drag. Jason felt the heat rising in his face, but he stood his ground. He could feel his chest tightening, his breaths coming in quick bursts. But he had to stay strong. "I know because he told me," Jason said, his voice faltering slightly. "He's a big deal at the Pentagon. He's important." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, like a story he had heard someone else tell. The more he said it, the less he believed it himself. He wasn't used to talking about his dad. His father wasn't the kind of person who needed to explain what he did, or why it mattered. He never talked about his job, his work, or where he went when he left home each morning. It was just something Jason had always known. His dad was important, and the Pentagon was his world. But how could anyone else understand that? Mrs. Henderson shook her head, clearly amused. "Well, Jason, I'm sure your dad is very important, but let's not get carried away," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I think we should leave. The Pentagon to the real grown-ups, don't you think?" A few of the other kids in the class snickered, and Jason's heart sank. He tried to look around the room for some sign of support, but the only faces he saw were those of students who found his words laughable. His friend, Marcus, looked uncomfortable, his eyes downcast. Jason's throat tightened, but he refused to back down. He couldn't. His dad had worked hard for everything he had, and Jason wasn't going to let anyone mock him for it. But as he opened his mouth to speak again, something unexpected happened. The door to the classroom slammed open, cutting off whatever words Jason had prepared to say. The class froze. The man standing in the doorway was tall, his broad shoulders filling the space as he stepped into the room. His presence was commanding, almost intimidating. Jason's stomach lurched as he recognized the man standing there. It was his father. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been expecting him, not like this. His dad was supposed to be at work, in Washington, D.C., miles away from this classroom. What was he doing here? Why now? The room fell silent, the students too stunned to speak, too stunned to even move. Mrs. Henderson's face drained of color. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly in disbelief. Jason's father didn't wait for anyone to speak. He simply walked to the front of the room, his polished black shoes clicking sharply against the floor. His dark suit, crisp and perfectly tailored, looked out of place in the classroom. He was a man who carried himself with a quiet authority, someone who didn't need to announce his presence. His black tie was perfectly straight, and his expression was calm, even serene, as though he had expected to be here all along. "Jason," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I'm here." Jason's dad didn't look at Mrs. Henderson or the class. His focus was on Jason, and only Jason. He gave him a small, reassuring nod, the kind that told Jason everything was going to be okay. But Mrs. Henderson was still standing frozen, her mouth agape, her eyes darting between the man and Jason. She couldn't have known who he was, she hadn't been expecting him either. "Mr. Williams," she stammered, trying to collect herself. What are you doing here?" Jason's dad didn't miss a beat. "I'm here to pick up my son," he said simply. "Is there a problem with that, Mrs. Henderson?" The room was so still it felt like time had stopped. The students sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, unable to comprehend what was happening. But Jason wasn't frozen. He wasn't lost in disbelief. He wasn't waiting for some logical explanation. He had known. He had always known. His dad was a man of few words, but Jason knew that when he said something, he meant it. And now, in front of everyone, his dad was proving it. Jason's heart surged with a mix of pride and fear. This wasn't just about proving himself to his classmates. It wasn't about defending his dad's honor. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was about understanding who his father really was, and what kind of man he had always been. And he had never been prouder. Mrs. Henderson's expression was a mix of shock and confusion, but she didn't press further. She took a step back, almost bowing her head in deference, as if she suddenly realized just how wrong she had been. Jason's dad turned to leave, giving Jason one last look, the silent reassurance in his eyes saying everything he couldn't put into words. "Let's go, Jason," his father said, his tone as calm as ever. Jason stood up, not looking back at his classmates. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their laughter. As he walked toward the door, the room seemed to close in around him, the voices fading into the background. All that mattered was the man standing before him, the man who had just walked in to prove something bigger than words. As they walked out of the classroom, Jason couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. How would his classmates treat him now? How would Mrs. Henderson react when she learned the truth? And what was his dad really doing at the Pentagon? But those questions would have to wait. For now, Jason was simply grateful to walk out of that classroom with his father by his side. Jason sat silently in the back of his father's car, his mind still racing from what had just happened. The school was miles behind them now, but the events of that morning felt like they had just happened seconds ago. He had barely said a word since they left the classroom, and his father hadn't pressed him to speak either. His father, Anthony Williams, was a man of few words. He had always been that way, quiet and composed, with a presence that commanded respect. Jason had never fully understood his dad's job, but he knew one thing for sure: his father wasn't just an ordinary man. The Pentagon? It wasn't a place for everyone. It was a place for the most powerful, the most secretive, the most influential people in the world. And Jason's dad worked there. Jason stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each question chasing the other. Why had his dad come to the school? Why had he waited until now to make his presence known? What was so important about his father's work that no one ever spoke of it? And why hadn't he told Jason the truth? The silence in the car was thick, almost suffocating. Jason wanted to ask his dad everything, to understand why his life had suddenly shifted in such an unexpected direction. But something stopped him. He knew his father wasn't one to talk freely. He had always been distant, always hidden behind a veil of mystery. There was something he wasn't saying, something that Jason wasn't ready to hear. "Dad?" Jason finally asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Anthony Williams didn't look away from the road. But he nodded slightly, acknowledging his son's voice. I don't get it," Jason continued, hesitating. "Why did you come to the school today? I didn't expect you to show up like that." Anthony's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a brief moment. He took a deep breath before answering, his voice calm yet firm. "It was necessary, Jason. Sometimes, people need to see the truth before they can understand." Jason furrowed his brow. "The truth about what?" Anthony paused again, but his answer was slow in coming. "About who you are. About who I am. And about the work I do." Jason's confusion deepened. "But you've never told me anything about your work. You always keep it a secret. You never talk about the Pentagon. You never." "I never wanted to put you in danger," his father interrupted, his voice steady but tinged with something that sounded like regret. "You don't understand, Jason. There are things in this world that can't be shared, not with anyone. Not even with family." Jason was silent for a moment, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "So what are you saying? That you've been hiding stuff from me? For my own good?" "I've been protecting you," Anthony replied, his tone softer now. "There are threats out there. Real ones. And I don't want you to be a part of it. Not yet." Jason could feel the lump in his throat tighten. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but he knew better than to push his father too hard. Anthony Williams wasn't someone you could push. He was a man of control, of boundaries. And Jason had learned over the years that when his father spoke, it was best to listen and absorb. They drove on in silence for a while longer, until they reached their destination. Jason glanced at the clock, nearly 3 in the afternoon. His school day had ended, but this was far from over. The car pulled up to a tall, glass building in the heart of the city. Jason had never been here before. The building was sleek, modern, and intimidating, with the kind of architecture that screamed power. He knew immediately that this was no ordinary office. This was a place of influence, a place where secrets were kept, and where things were done quietly, behind closed doors. They parked, and Jason's father opened his door without saying a word. Jason hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but one thing was clear, he was being drawn into something much bigger than he ever could have imagined. Jason followed his father into the building, trying to keep his nerves in check. The lobby was quiet, almost eerily so, and the security was tight. He had never been in a place like this before. The guards at the front desk barely looked up as they entered, but Jason could feel their eyes on him. There was a heavy, almost suffocating tension in the air, like they were walking into a place that was both a fortress and a labyrinth of secrets. They rode the elevator to the top floor, where Jason's father had an office. Jason had heard of this building before, he knew it was a part of the greater Pentagon operations, a subsidiary, a shadow of the real thing. But it felt just as powerful, just as secretive. As the elevator doors opened, Jason was met with a long, dimly lit hallway. There were no windows, just the cold, sterile walls of the building. The lights overhead flickered faintly, casting strange shadows across the floor. His father walked ahead of him, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. They stopped in front of a large metal door at the end of the hallway. Anthony Williams didn't knock. Instead, he turned the handle and stepped inside. Jason followed him, his heart pounding. The room was unlike any Jason had ever seen. It was a large, high-tech space, filled with screens and computers. Maps of the world covered one wall, and several monitors displayed live feeds from all over the globe. There were men and women working quietly at their desks, speaking in hushed voices. Some wore military uniforms, others were in business suits. All of them looked up for a moment when Jason and his father entered, but they quickly returned to their tasks, not a word spoken. "This is where I work," Anthony said, his voice low as he motioned to the room. "And this is where you'll begin to understand why I've kept you in the dark." Jason's mind was spinning. The tension in the room was thick, and he could feel the weight of the secrets pressing in on him. It was all too much. Too many questions, and no answers. "I don't understand," Jason said, his voice shaking. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you're old enough now," Anthony replied. "Because it's time you knew the truth about your father's work. And about the dangers that come with it." Jason's father turned to one of the workers, a woman with short black hair and sharp eyes. "Prepare the files," he said simply. The woman nodded and began typing rapidly on a keyboard. Jason could see that whatever was happening here was serious, and that his father wasn't just involved in some regular job. There was something more going on, a mystery that Jason wasn't even sure he was ready to understand. The woman turned to them, holding up a thick folder. "Everything's in here," she said. "All the details. The truth." Jason's father took the folder from her, his hands steady. He handed it to Jason without a word. Jason took it, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The pages inside were marked with top-secret stamps, the kind of markings that sent chills down his spine. What was in this folder? What kind of secrets did it hold? And why was his father so eager for him to know? "I want you to read it," Anthony said quietly. "I want you to understand." Jason's mind raced as he opened the folder, but he knew one thing for sure, whatever was inside was going to change everything. Jason stared at the folder in his hands, its weight heavier than he could have imagined. The top-secret stamps on the outside seemed to pulse in the dim light of the room. He could feel the heat of his father's gaze on him as he opened the folder, but he hesitated. What if he wasn't ready for what was inside? What if the truth was more terrifying than he could ever have imagined? "Go ahead," his father said, his voice low but firm. "It's time you understood what's been kept from you." Jason's hands trembled as he turned the first page. His eyes scanned the text quickly, trying to make sense of the words. The first document was an overview, a brief summary of operations. It made little sense to him at first, filled with jargon he couldn't understand, words like classified, national security, and strategic objectives. But the further he read, the more his confusion deepened. This wasn't about some regular government work. This was about something far larger, something that was so secretive it had never even been whispered in the media. His father's voice broke his focus. "You can't tell anyone what you read here, Jason. Not even your closest friends. This is bigger than anything you've ever known." Jason's head shot up, his heart racing. "What do you mean? What's so important? What is all this?" Anthony Williams stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I can't explain everything right now. But I'll tell you what you need to know. And you'll be the one to decide what happens next." Jason nodded, trying to steady his breathing. He turned to the next page, his eyes widening as he saw the names. There were lists of people, government officials, military personnel, high-ranking diplomats. The names meant nothing to him, but the connections, the network, were evident. The men and women listed here weren't just involved in any average operations, they were involved in something far more complex. Jason's head spun as he tried to piece together the puzzle. The next page was a map, a world map with pins marking locations around the globe. There were dozens of them, each one indicating a place of interest. Some were countries Jason had heard of, others were remote, barely recognized on a map. And yet, each of these locations had something in common, they were linked to something deep, something dark. Each pin was tied to an event, an operation, or a secret mission that had changed the course of history in ways Jason couldn't even begin to comprehend. He skimmed through the rest of the documents, trying to take it all in. There were records of covert missions, intelligence operations, and strategic partnerships. There were diagrams of military installations, secret meeting locations, and detailed descriptions of technology that didn't seem possible for its time. Jason couldn't believe what he was reading. The truth about his father's job was far beyond what he could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about high-level government work, this was about power, influence, and control on a global scale. And Jason's father, Anthony Williams, was at the heart of it all. Jason closed the folder, his mind reeling. What is all of this? Why didn't you tell me? Why keep me in the dark all these years? Anthony took a deep breath. It's not just about protecting you, Jason. It's about protecting everyone. There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to understand. If you know too much, you become a target. If people realize who you are, they'll come after you. Jason's stomach twisted. Who would come after me? There are people out there who will do anything to get their hands on this information. They'll stop at nothing to manipulate and control everything. Your mother and I have kept you safe by keeping you away from it all. But now, it's time for you to know the truth. It's time for you to understand why I've done what I've done. Jason was silent for a moment, trying to process everything. His father had worked in the shadows his entire life, keeping Jason and his family away from the chaos that surrounded his world. But now, Jason was being thrust into the center of it. The secrets, the lies, the danger, he was part of it all. Why are you showing me this now? Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why me? I'm just a kid. I don't understand any of this. Anthony looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. You're not a kid anymore, Jason. You're old enough to make decisions. You're old enough to see what's been hidden from you. And when the time comes, you'll have to make a choice. A choice that could change everything. Jason didn't know what to say. The weight of his father's words settled heavily on his shoulders. He had always admired his dad, looked up to him, even. But now, the admiration felt different. His father wasn't just a man who worked at the Pentagon. He was part of something much bigger, much more dangerous than Jason had ever realized. Before Jason could respond, the door to the room opened, and the woman with the short black hair entered. She had a look of urgency in her eyes. Mr. Williams, she said, her voice tight with tension. We have a problem. Jason's father stood up immediately, his expression hardening. What's happened? There's been a breach, the woman replied. A leak. Someone's gotten their hands on the files. Jason's heart skipped a beat. A leak? The files? Were they talking about the same documents Jason had just read? Who? Anthony asked, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. Who's responsible? The woman hesitated for a moment before answering. We don't know for sure. But there are rumors. We've traced the IP address to a location overseas. It's connected to one of the groups you've been monitoring. Jason's father's face turned pale. He turned to Jason, his eyes filled with an emotion Jason had never seen before, fear. I need you to listen to me, Jason, Anthony said, his voice urgent. You're in danger now. You and your mother. I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to be part of this world. But you're in it now. And you need to stay hidden. Jason felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He had always thought of his dad as invincible, untouchable. But now, he realized how fragile their world really was. His father wasn't just a man with a top-secret job. He was a man fighting a battle that Jason couldn't even begin to understand. We're going to have to leave, Anthony said, his voice grave. We need to go now. Jason's mind was spinning. Leave? What did that even mean? Where would they go? What was happening? Where are we going? Jason asked, his voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," his father replied, his tone final. "Just stay close, and don't ask any more questions." But Jason couldn't help himself. He had to know. "Dad, what's going on? Who are these people? What do they want with us?" His father turned to him, his expression hardening. "There's no time for questions. We have to go. Now." Jason stood up, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: his life was never going to be the same. The quiet, normal life he had known was gone. And now, he was part of something far bigger, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As they left the room and headed toward the elevator, Jason glanced back at the folder. It was still sitting on the desk, filled with secrets, lies, and dangers he couldn't comprehend. But he knew one thing: he was going to have to figure it all out. He was going to have to face whatever came next. There was no turning back now. Jason's world had been turned upside down in just a matter of hours. His life, once a routine of school and family dinners, now felt like a distant memory. His father's calm demeanor in the face of imminent danger had always been something Jason admired, but now, it only filled him with dread. What was his father hiding? What had Jason unknowingly stepped into? They had left the building as quietly as they had entered, and the drive away from the city had been long and tense. Jason's mind raced, unable to catch up with the events of the day. It felt surreal, like he was living someone else's nightmare. The simple truth was this: everything had changed. The man he had always looked up to, his father, wasn't just a worker at the Pentagon. He was deeply involved in something far more complex and dangerous than Jason could have ever imagined. The car's tires hummed on the asphalt as they sped through the night. The city lights faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the countryside. Jason sat in the back, eyes fixed out the window, trying to make sense of it all. But every time he thought he understood, more questions arose, more pieces of the puzzle scattered in every direction. "Dad," Jason said, his voice trembling slightly. "Where are we going?" Anthony didn't look at him but kept his eyes on the road. His jaw was clenched, and his knuckles gripped the steering wheel tightly. "We're going to a safe house," he answered briefly. Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure if he understood what that really meant. A safe house? Were they being hunted? Who would be after them? The silence between them was deafening. Jason had so many questions, but he knew better than to push. His father had never been one to explain things. He was the kind of man who did what needed to be done and expected those around him to understand, or at least, to follow. The car finally slowed, and they turned down a narrow, winding road. The trees on either side of the path were thick, their branches stretching out like dark, skeletal fingers in the dim light of the headlights. The only sound was the crunch of tires on gravel, echoing in the night. Jason felt a cold chill run down his spine. They arrived at the safe house just after midnight. It was a small, isolated house on the edge of a forest. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life except for the faint flicker of a porch light. The place looked abandoned, but Jason could sense that it was anything but. This wasn't a typical vacation cabin or countryside retreat. This was a place meant for hiding, hidden from the world. As soon as they stepped out of the car, Jason felt the weight of the air around him. The quiet was suffocating. No one spoke as they made their way into the house. Anthony led Jason inside, flicking on a series of low lights that illuminated the entryway in a soft glow. "We're safe for now," Anthony said quietly, locking the door behind them. "But don't get comfortable. We can't stay here long." Jason took in the room as he followed his father inside. It was sparsely furnished, with only the essentials: 2 couches, a small kitchen, and a table in the center. The walls were bare, and the only decoration was a map on one wall, dotted with various locations. Jason's eyes fell on it instinctively, but before he could study it further, his father spoke again. "I need you to stay here," Anthony said. "I'll check in with some contacts and figure out our next move." Jason looked up, his confusion growing. "What's going on, Dad? Who's after us?" Anthony didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the table, placing a few documents down in front of him. His fingers skimmed over the papers as he took a seat. Jason noticed the faint tremor in his father's hand. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable. It unsettled him. "I don't want to scare you, Jason," Anthony said, his voice almost a whisper. "But there are people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. The information you saw today, what's in those files, it's dangerous. There are powerful people who want it. People who will hurt anyone to get their hands on it." Jason swallowed hard, trying to digest the weight of his father's words. "But you're not telling me everything," he said, his voice shaking. "What exactly is it they want? What's so important about those files?" Anthony looked up at him, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But I'll give you what you need to know." Jason sat down across from his father, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His mind was spinning. The man he had looked up to, the man who had always seemed invincible, was now the one who was in danger. And Jason was caught in the middle of it. "There's a reason why I've kept you away from this life, Jason," Anthony said, his voice hoarse. "I've tried to protect you from all of this. But now that you're involved, you have to understand, there are no easy answers. There's no simple way out of this. You have to stay sharp, and you have to trust me. If we don't get ahead of this now, everything could fall apart." Jason nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation weighing on him. "What do we do now?" Anthony stood up abruptly, his movements sharp and deliberate. "Now, we wait." Later that night, Jason woke with a start, the sound of something scraping against the windows pulling him from a restless sleep. He sat up, his heart pounding, his breath quickening. The safe house was still dark, and his father was nowhere to be found. The map on the wall had caught his attention again, but there was something unsettling about the silence. It was too quiet. He pushed the covers aside and quietly crept out of bed, his bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. His breath was shallow as he moved toward the window, his hand on the edge of the curtain, hesitating. Through the glass, he could see figures moving outside, their shadows dark against the dimly lit landscape. They were too close to the house. Too many of them. Jason felt his pulse quicken as he slowly backed away from the window. His father had warned him, but he hadn't realized the depth of the danger until now. Jason's instincts told him something was wrong. His father had told him to stay hidden, to stay safe, but this wasn't a normal situation. There was no safety here. Not anymore. He turned and rushed toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle when he heard it, a faint knock, barely audible over the storm raging in his chest. It was slow and deliberate, almost methodical. Jason froze. He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure if he should open the door or hide. His mind raced, torn between the fear of the unknown and the need to know what was happening outside. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't his father at the door. Jason's heart thudded against his chest as the knock came again. Slow, deliberate, almost. As if whoever was outside knew exactly how to frighten him. The shadows outside the window seemed to stretch longer, as if the darkness itself was closing in on him. For a split second, he debated whether to open the door. His mind flashed back to his father's warning, "Stay hidden. Don't trust anyone." But the knock seemed urgent, like someone was waiting for him to answer. He quickly glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one else was in the room with him. He was alone. The map on the wall loomed over him, the red pins marking unknown locations he still didn't understand. His eyes darted to the pile of documents his father had left behind on the table. It felt like all of it was connected, the mysterious files, the dark figures outside, his father's cryptic words. Jason's breath caught in his throat as another knock sounded, louder this time, sharper. The person outside was growing impatient. He had no choice. His father wasn't here. Jason had to make a decision, stand there paralyzed by fear, or open the door and face whatever came next. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away, to remain hidden. But the question was still there, who was knocking, and what did they want? With a deep breath, Jason yanked the door open. Standing on the other side of the threshold was a woman, tall and lean, with short black hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to study him in a way that made him feel as though she could see straight through him. She was dressed in dark clothing, her face serious, almost grim. There was an air of danger about her, an unspoken warning that sent a chill up Jason's spine. She didn't speak immediately. She just stared at him, her eyes calculating. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice betraying his fear. The woman's lips curled into a tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm here to help," she said, her voice cold but not unfriendly. "Is your father here?" Jason hesitated. His father had told him not to trust anyone, especially not now. He wanted to slam the door shut, but something about the woman's demeanor held him back. The way she spoke, the urgency in her eyes, made him think she was telling the truth. But he couldn't afford to take any chances. "No," Jason replied, his voice shaky. "He's not here." The woman's gaze flickered briefly, a flash of concern passing through her eyes, but it was gone in an instant. She stepped closer, just enough to be inside the doorway. Jason instinctively stepped back. "I know you're scared," she said, her tone softer now. "But you need to listen to me. There's no time. You and your father are in grave danger." Jason's stomach twisted with fear. "What kind of danger?" he asked. "Who are you?" "I'll explain everything," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But first, we need to get out of here. Now." Before Jason could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made his heart skip. He rushed to the window, his pulse racing as he peered through the curtain. In the distance, a black SUV was parked on the side of the road, its engine running. Several figures stood around it, talking in low voices, their movements cautious but deliberate. Jason's stomach dropped. These weren't people he recognized. They were dressed in black, their faces hidden by hoods. They looked like a well-organized group, too organized, too dangerous. The woman noticed Jason's reaction. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice sharp. "We need to leave now." Jason turned back to her, his mind spinning. His father had told him to stay hidden, but now he had no idea what was happening. Who were these people? Why were they after his father? And why was the woman so eager to help? "I can't just leave," Jason said, his voice cracking. "What about my dad?" "Your father is already in motion," she replied. "But you, Jason, you're the one they're after now. They'll come for you next, and when they do, it won't be pretty." Jason's head was spinning. He wanted to believe her, but something felt off. His father had always been the one to protect him, to keep him safe. But now, Jason was alone in this house, with a stranger at the door, and a group of unknown people lurking outside. "Who are they?" Jason demanded. "Who wants us?" The woman's eyes darkened, her expression hardening. "I can't tell you everything right now. But I'll say this, you're caught in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. These people have been watching your family for a long time. Your father has worked on projects that many would kill to control. And they will stop at nothing to get what they want." Jason's mind raced. He had heard rumors, whispers from his father about high-stakes missions, about the secrecy surrounding his work. But hearing it from a stranger, someone who clearly knew more than he was letting on, was a wake-up call. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. "What do we do?" Jason asked, his voice a mix of fear and determination. "We leave," she said. "We go now. And you trust me, Jason. If we stay here, we won't survive." "They're already on their way." Jason's gaze flickered to the window again. The figures outside were moving toward the house, their footsteps silent but purposeful. The fear in his chest tightened, but there was no time to think. He had to make a decision. With a nod, Jason grabbed his jacket and quickly followed the woman out the door. The night air was cold, and the forest seemed to swallow them whole as they moved away from the house, their footsteps muffled by the underbrush. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the woman through the trees, the SUV's headlights casting long shadows behind them. They moved quickly but cautiously, the woman leading the way. Jason barely had time to catch his breath before she stopped suddenly, turning to face him. "We need to hide," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Follow me." Jason didn't question her. He didn't have the time or the energy to question anything anymore. The world he knew, the simple life he had grown up with, was gone. Now, he was in a race against time, running from people he didn't understand and couldn't trust. They pushed through the trees, their steps swift and silent, until they reached a small cabin in the distance. It was nestled in the woods, almost invisible from the road. The woman motioned for Jason to be quiet as they approached the door, and with one swift motion, she unlocked it. The inside was sparse, but there were signs that someone had been here recently: blankets piled on a chair, an overturned mug, a half-empty bottle of water. The woman led Jason inside and closed the door quietly behind them. "I need you to stay here," she said. "And don't make a sound. They'll be looking for us, but if we stay hidden long enough, we might make it out of this." Jason nodded, trying to steady his breathing. The cabin was silent, the only sound the occasional creak of wood as the night wore on. He couldn't help but wonder what was happening to his father, and why these people were after them. What had his father been involved in? And how did this strange woman fit into the puzzle? His mind buzzed with questions, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he was forced to sit in silence and wait. He had no answers, only the fear of what would happen next. The cabin was colder than Jason had anticipated. The only warmth came from the distant glow of the moon outside, filtering through the cracks in the walls and illuminating the sparse furnishings. The woman, who had introduced herself as Lena, stood by the window, her figure shadowed in the dim light. Jason sat on a nearby chair, his mind swirling with the chaos of the last few hours. Fear had taken hold of him, squeezing tight at his chest. His father's absence weighed heavily on him, but he knew the truth was closer than ever. Lena had said they had to hide. That they couldn't stay at the safe house. But Jason was growing restless. Every passing minute, every creak in the cabin, made his heart race. It was as if danger were lurking just beyond the door. His father's warning echoed in his mind: there are people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. But Jason hadn't fully grasped the meaning behind those words until now. His life had always seemed simple: school, friends, family. But now he was thrust into a world he never knew existed, a world of shadows, secrets, and threats. His father's work at the Pentagon hadn't just been a job, it had been a life-or-death mission, one that Jason had no choice but to be part of. Lena broke the silence. "They'll come for us soon," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We don't have much time." Jason stood, the weight of her words sinking in. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Because I've been on the other side," Lena replied, her eyes meeting his. "I've seen how they operate. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. What is it they want? Why is my father so important? Lena's face softened, but only for a moment. She turned away, pacing slightly before answering. Your father has been part of a project for years, Jason. A project that has been kept under wraps. It's about more than just government secrets. It's about power, power that could change everything. Jason took a step closer. What kind of power? The kind that no one should have, Lena said. The kind that's dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. Your father, he's been trying to stop it. But now, they're closing in on him. And you. The words were like a punch to the gut. Jason had no idea what Lena was talking about. His father had always been distant, secretive about his work, but Jason had never imagined anything like this. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance. Jason froze, his heart racing. It was coming closer. Too close. Lena moved quickly to the door, peering through the small crack in the wood. Her eyes narrowed. They're here, she whispered, her voice tense. Jason felt a surge of panic. His thoughts scrambled for a plan, but there was no time. Lena's face was set in determination, but Jason could see the fear in her eyes too. She knew the danger was real. They were running out of time. Lena turned back to Jason, her face serious. Listen to me, she said, her voice firm. They know we're here. We need to move. Now. Jason nodded, his mind still struggling to keep up with the whirlwind of events. He followed Lena as she hurried to the back of the cabin, pulling him through the narrow hall to a small door. It opened to a patch of dense woods, dark and suffocating. Jason didn't ask questions, he knew they didn't have the luxury of time. Lena led the way, her steps light but quick, cutting through the trees. Jason kept his eyes focused on her back, trying to ignore the pounding of his heart. The tension in the air was palpable. He had no idea where they were going or what would happen next, but the cold reality was clear, his world had already changed, and now he was running from people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy him and anyone in their path. The ground beneath their feet was soft, the forest floor slick with dew. Jason stumbled a few times but kept going, his legs burning with the effort. He had no idea how long they had been running, but it felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. They came to a clearing, the moonlight spilling across the open space. In the center of the clearing stood a black SUV. Jason's stomach dropped. The same vehicle from earlier. The same group of people. Lena stopped abruptly, her body tense. Stay behind me, she said, her voice a low whisper. Jason did as he was told, pressing his back against a tree, trying to remain unseen. His pulse was racing, his breath shallow. He had no idea what to expect, but the fear gnawed at him, telling him that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be good. From the SUV, a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that seemed too formal for the middle of the woods. His face was hard, devoid of any emotion. He scanned the area, his eyes flicking toward the trees with a methodical precision. Lena, the man's voice rang out, deep and cold. We know you're here. Come out now. Lena's hand tightened around the strap of her bag, her eyes never leaving the man. You don't know what you're dealing with, she called out, her voice defiant but controlled. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. You can't run forever. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the boy. You know that, don't you? Jason's breath caught in his throat. The boy. They were talking about him. He was the reason they were here. They were after him. Lena took a step forward, her eyes fierce. You think you can control him? He's just a child. The man didn't move, but the air around them seemed to grow heavier. Jason doesn't know anything about the power he holds, the man said, his voice cold and calculating. But he will. And when he does, he'll realize how much he's worth. Jason's mind spun. What power? What did this man mean? He didn't understand. The man's eyes shifted to Jason, narrowing as he took a slow, deliberate step toward him. You've seen too much already, haven't you, boy? You're involved now. Whether you like it or not. Jason stepped back, but Lena was already in motion. She moved quickly, positioning herself between Jason and the man. You don't get to have him, she said, her voice like steel. Not today. The man's expression remained unchanged. You're out of time, Lena. We both know how this ends. Lena's gaze flickered briefly, a look of realization flashing in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. In fact, she seemed almost resigned. I never wanted it to come to this. Before Jason could ask what she meant, Lena turned sharply and ran straight for the SUV. The man didn't react immediately, but he followed her movements, his eyes cold and calculating. Jason's confusion only deepened as he watched Lena approach the vehicle, her figure darting between the trees. She had done this before, she knew how to handle herself. But what was her plan? Was she leading them away from him? Or was there more to the story than he understood? Suddenly, gunshots rang out in the distance. Lena didn't stop. She didn't flinch. And that's when it hit him. The final revelation. The people after him weren't just after secrets or power. They were after control. And Jason was the key to everything. The narrative reaches its final, intense climax. Jason is thrust into the eye of the storm as Lena confronts the mysterious figures hunting them, revealing that Jason himself holds the key to something monumental. The stakes are higher than ever, and the final confrontation leaves the reader with a sense of suspense and intrigue. Jason must now face the truth about his father, the power at stake, and his own role in the unfolding mystery.